Hi, everybody. Hello, welcome back from lunch. Hope everybody had their fair share of sliders. This is the blockchain design track. Thank you for joining us. And we're going to kick it off with a really spicy debate, how to scale Ethereum. So please make some noise for our guest and our panelist, Macauley.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, we've had a little change of debaters. We had lost Zahn this morning, and at the invitation of two of our remaining panelists, we've invited Max Resnick from Enza to join, along with Dan Robinson from Paradigm and Matt from Spire, also known as mteam. Spire Labs, I should say. Yeah, it's a perennial topic for today, which is ETH scaling. Yeah, we're going to do this as a little bit of a debate format. So I'll give each presenter a chance to give an opening statement that is sort of their high-level vision about ETH scaling over the next, let's say, 2 years. And we'll do some rebuttals and continue with some questions and a lightning round and closing statements. All right. So without further ado, who'd like to kick us off with your vision for ETH scaling? Dan?
Yeah. Hi, so Dan Robinson. I'm a general partner at Paradigm, which is a crypto asset investment firm. But I should say that nothing I say here is going to be investment advice, and I'm talking about my own views and not those of the firm. So I think the broad statement for how I think we should scale Ethereum is I think we should roughly try everything, and I think we should be supportive of basically every scaling solution that people are trying. Some of them may work better than others. I think some of them I have big technical disagreements with, but I think we should avoid ideological objections to a lot of those, because I think ultimately what's going to matter most for Ethereum success is scaling in some way or another. So I would say I'm strong yes on increasing the L1 bandwidth and reducing latency on it. I think that is going to require things like compromising on node validator requirements and running heavier validators. I think we should be trying other things at that layer. But then also I'm very supportive of L2s and people running L2s, including with centralized sequencers, ZK L2s, optimistic L2s. And I think all of that generally accrues to the benefit of the Ethereum ecosystem. So I'd say I've maybe then the just yes to all solution to scaling.
So disclaimer from me that I was roped into this panel, so I don't spend very much time thinking about Ethereum, but when I do, I have a lot of thoughts about it. So just a disclaimer in case anybody gets mad that Max Resnick is up here talking about Ethereum again. But my first take would be, like, if you go to a developing country who has an economy that's like 1/100th of the size of the United States, and you ask them, how are you going to do GDP growth? The thing that you should not do if you're that developing country is try to do something completely different than what everybody else is doing. And that's the situation that Ethereum finds itself in today. Solana today has 100 times the TPS, 27 times faster latency, or even faster, depending on how you count shreds, than the Ethereum L1. And Ethereum researchers are going and trying to do something completely different than what we already know works. There are like 10 different chains that are way faster than Ethereum, all doing very basic things, moving bits around, executing things, making performance changes in the client. And Ethereum is running around like a chicken with its head cut off, talking about ZK, talking about rollups, talking about scaling in every other way than the ways that we know already work.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Matthew, or mteam. My voice is almost gone, so I'm sorry if you can't hear me. I believe that Ethereum should follow roughly what the EF has put out, with a few kind of prioritization changes. So that means scale the layer 1, scaling blobs, and improving user experience. For scaling the layer 1, I believe we should raise node requirements pretty dramatically, perhaps making it incompatible with home staking and home proposing specifically. I believe that we will have major changes to the consensus protocol in the next few years that will enable feather staking, as Justin calls it, and that something like this can reintroduce verification of the Ethereum network on a very low hardware requirement basis. I also believe that the one of the most important directions for Ethereum right now is to keep in mind that we're not trying to scale a chain, we're trying to scale Ethereum. And Ethereum comes with a lot of cultural baggage, a lot of TVL, and a lot of history. And so we have for example, we have a bunch of consensus clients and execution clients. We have to figure out how to move those to the future. we have a lot of layer twos that have, I think benefited Ethereum, but also hindered it in some ways. And so we need to figure out how to not only scale a chain in the best way possible, but also, think about the specifics of Ethereum and our history and where that brings us today.
All right, and speaking of your voice, I think one tip for this room is to speak a little bit slower than you otherwise would, and also a little bit closer to the mic than you otherwise would as well. Let's continue on with the subject of rollups. You alluded to this and have certainly spoken a lot about it before, Matt, but to what extent do you think that based rollups are going to be very important to Ethereum's future?
Yeah, so I mean, this panel is about scaling, and I don't think based rollups are, I'll say they're a little bit tangential to scaling. Based rollups are essentially the idea of taking the sequencing of Ethereum and exporting it to another chain, a layer 2. And I believe that the foundation here remains the sequencing of the layer 1. And so without scaling the layer 1 sequencing, we can't do scaled based rollups. And so while I do think rollups are a part of the scaling solution, I would advise teams to stick with hyperscaled centralized sequencer layer 2s like Mega ETH, like Rise, and then see where they can go from there as the Ethereum layer 1 sequencer scales.
And in terms
I think we probably all agree on that then. Yeah.
in terms of the rollup centric roadmap as the sort of North Star of Ethereum.
Well, does anybody think that it's still the North Star of Ethereum? I think it's like the soldiers in Iwo Jima who are still fighting the war 20 years later. I think even the EF and many of the core devs have abandoned that North Star. So why are we still talking about it? Why are they still talking about pure DAS in the next hard fork when we know that the rollup centric roadmap is not good for ETH? It's very strange, but for some reason Ethereum doesn't have the ability to disagree and then commit to the new path. So if the pivot is real, and now Ethereum is scaling the L1, then 100% of the focus should be on scaling the L1. And if everybody is wrong and L2s should have been the focus and should still be the focus, then they should be scaling the L2s still and shouldn't have pivoted. So they need to choose a direction, because part of the unfortunate situation that ETH finds itself in is core dev. There are a bunch of structural issues. There are 5 different clients. As you said, there's a lot of TVL. So you have to be very slow when making changes. So naturally, you just don't have enough ability to make substantial progress on many different streams at the same time, unfortunately. And I think if you choose to split the middle, you're going to end up achieving neither goal in a timely manner, and that's not good for ETH.
I would say, I think to some extent, I agree that scaling the L1 should be the priority. I don't think that these actually are tracks that you can only do one of. I think to some extent it's different researchers. A lot of the time it's different companies. And so I think the choice that we're actually talking about, and what Max has suggested in his more provocative moments, is that in addition to dedicating L1 research resources to scaling the L1, L1 should also basically declare war on the L2s that are there and try to do whatever possible to shut them down or drive them away.
If you have an employee who's underperforming, who you hired to increase the value of your company, and they start to underperform and they actually start to take a bunch of value away and they start to poach your clients for their own personal business, you fire them. It's not declaring war, it's just being practical. And at this point, none of the L2s are providing more value to ETH than they're taking. And so what they should do, I'm not suggesting anything drastic. I'm just saying stop dedicating one of the most valuable lifebloods of Ethereum, which is core dev time and attention, to L2s when they don't matter and they're not good for Ethereum. Dedicate it to scaling the L1, which does matter and is good for Ethereum.
Yeah, so I think this gets to a really disagreement that isn't necessarily directly about how to scale Ethereum, but is more about how does Ethereum capture value that Max and I have. Where part of my belief is that the L2 roadmap, while actually I think it has had a lot of weaknesses in terms of how well it scales Ethereum, and that the experience of using a lot of different L2s is still pretty bad. And I think that's the development on that is just much far behind where we would I've liked it to have been just as far as experience. So it doesn't work as well as a scaling solution as we had hoped. I do think it has actually worked decently well for preserving capturing value for the Ethereum ecosystem, because you have a lot of projects that otherwise would potentially be launching their own chains somewhere else, instead choosing to launch on the an L2 on Ethereum. I think that as a business development strategy actually has played out relatively well in how it would have been expected. And I think the risk if you declare war on L2s at that point is that you basically turn that against you, and then potentially you're competing with L2s that then aren't tethered to Ethereum anymore.
I mean, wasn't it like all of the ETH people on Twitter were complaining about the fact that Coinbase, who's operating the largest Ethereum L2, had 4 hours of content at their conference here in New York recently and didn't mention ETH once, because it doesn't matter to them, because they're in control of their own distribution and brand and users, and they could turn off blobs and posting today and move to Celestia or move to Eigenlayer DA or any of the other DA solutions, and nobody would even notice and nobody would care, other than the ETH people would lose their shit on Twitter. But I feel like for Ethereum, it seems like great in the moment. It's like a drug, and you take the drug, it's like, oh, Robinhood wants to build on us today. And then in 2 years, you realize that actually Robinhood wanted to build their own thing, and they're just taking your open source technology for free and using it to monetize their existing customer base, and you're getting completely screwed.
Again, I think we're getting off topic on the subject of scaling Ethereum, and I bet there'll be another panel later today that will be a good one that people should come to that I unfortunately have to miss. But all right, I think my view is anything that is using ETH as its money is good for Ethereum. Base uses ETH as its native token on it. That, in my view, is good for the value of Ethereum. We should have this debate in full at some point.
Right. Well, in part, the ideas of scaling via rollups is that you're also, again, scaling the innovation, scaling the business development, the distribution, and the distribution for ETH. So that's a type of scaling that's not exactly what we're talking about at sort of an infra level, but certainly has some value. But maybe we can look at another unique quality of Ethereum, which is the way that its governance process unfolds in terms of who's making decisions and how those decisions are made in a committee. That's I think partly its strength and also partly its weakness. And we saw a bit of a contentious removal of a feature EOF in the spring that had been part of the roadmap for a long time and was kind of pulled at the last minute. This is a little bit symbolic of some of the issues that Ethereum has. I'd like to go down and see, if you have thoughts on how, if there are any lessons that have been learned from that maybe is going to help Ethereum improve, that can implement technical changes down the road more smoothly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about the ways we can improve the governance process for upgrading Ethereum. I don't know if we necessarily need to make too many protocol changes in order to scale Ethereum. I'm more on the camp of we can get really far by just increasing node requirements, reducing validator count with validator consolidation, and that'll get us, to a point where we can start looking at some of those things. And so I wouldn't stress that governance is super important, but I do think that, and I've talked pretty extensively about this to Josh Stark, for example, from the EF. I think the core devs process is trash, and we need some form of prioritization set by a different committee than the implementers, because right now we have everyone in the same call, and so we have technical issues being brought up that change prioritization, and I think that's a pretty massive issue. And so I absolutely think we should have the co-executive director of the EF, Tomas, to take more control of setting priorities. I know we have a team of researchers at the EF that are in charge of setting long-term priorities for Ethereum, but it would be really nice to have someone just pressing really hard on coordination.
Can we talk specifically about the issues? So basically, as Ethereum has developed, the line that you need to pass to get an EIP through for some of the more complicated EIPs has increased and increased. So you need more and more of you don't need just a proof of concept implementation. you don't need just the EIP, you need almost like a full-fledged spec for this thing. And then you have devs that are doing, in many cases, a lot of work on EIPs that are not yet included or agreed to be included in the protocol. And that's exactly what happened with EOF, which, whether you agree or not with the change, it was a very sad situation that they spent so much time, so many dev hours on a change that ultimately didn't end up making it in. So the way we do it in Solana is we don't spend very much time on SIMDs that are not already approved and included in the SIMD repo, which is things that have already been approved. And we very rarely have these situations where we get to the end of the line and something has to get pulled when it's already completely done and all the dev hours have gone into it. Sometimes that does happen, but it's for security reasons after, an audit finds something and we have to pull it. But we never have this situation where, some guy named Frankie is lost on Twitter, starts fudding the EIP and all of a sudden it gets pulled last second. I agree that basically there was no reason for Ethereum to spend any dev time on any EVM changes. I just think it's really sad and really demoralizing for the devs who worked really hard on it, and it reflects a really broken part of the EIP process.
Yeah, I would say I agree that I think that that issue was largely on the roadmap setting process, and I think where you had this very fuzzy choice of what to actually even start implementing or commitments about what would actually be included. And I do think recently the Ethereum has gotten better at having more top-down directed roadmap decisions, including I think through saying we're going to focus on the IPs that actually matter for this top line goal of scaling L1. I think one more thing I'd add is I think the way that the multiple client equilibrium has evolved has been pretty bad for development pace, where you could imagine a world where having many client development teams means that any of these teams could try out features and propose them very easily, and then if a couple of clients where supported it, then we can push this change forward. I think instead what we have is this decision by consensus process where not only does every client team have a voice on what gets included, but ultimately the slowest one to implement it ultimately sets the pace at which the feature gets included. And I think we just have to be more willing to push these teams in terms of development timelines if we're going to have so many client teams.
Just to touch on one specific point, which was the fuzziness of inclusion. So there's this whole grading scale of considered for inclusion, recommended for inclusion, and a bunch of soft fuzzy guarantees in between. I think it partly reflects the admirable goal of not trying to formalize the process too much, because when you formalize the game, then the game gets gamed, and that's not great. Unfortunately, when you don't formalize the game, you have these situations where people think that something is in and it's not in, and then they go spend a bunch of time on it only for the situation on the ground to change in between the time it takes to develop it and the time it goes in. And so I think having some formalism of one thing I suggested is all of the client teams should submit in writing their opinions on every EIP. And I think there should be almost no verbal debate in core dev calls, because it's a completely unproductive situation. Most of the people who comment on EIPs have no expertise or have not even read the EIP before they comment. And this is a very common problem, and it causes a lot of great EIPs to fail. And I suggest all the client teams should, basically there should be some level of which somebody like Tim Bako decides this is a EIP that is ready to go. It is mature enough to go to the client teams for a decision. And then the client teams submit a written decision. And ultimately, at the end of the day, there's a vote based on how many people are running your client and your stake. Ultimately, if you're a client that has 0.5% of the network running you, then you should not have the same amount of say on the call as a client that has 50% of the stake running you. And unfortunately, the verbal debate kind of tends to benefit the loudest and the filibusters and everything. It's a pretty broken game, and I would like to see some kind of switch to a written system. That's what we have de facto in Solana, because all the comments on the SIMDs are on the GitHub, and so you can see the technical debate in the GitHub, and there's no there's no on Zoom call somebody trying to filibuster a situation because you refer to the arguments on the GitHub.
Maybe just a quick follow-up for Dan, because on this EOF topic, Ethereum functions through basically consensus building for new features, and this was a feature that had built consensus over a long period of time. And one of the things that changed was the sort of loss of support from the Reth team that to me seemed to tip the balance between it effectively being recognized as having lost consensus in effect that ultimately resulted in it being pulled. Does that seem correct with you?
I would say I wasn't directly involved in this decision. As far as I observed it, I would say the Reth team may have been like the last domino to fall, but certainly was not the first. And I'd say, they put a lot of effort into implementing it and evaluating it. I think that was ultimately the decision they came to, but I think it was largely reflecting consensus rather than driving it. But yeah, I wasn't directly involved in that in their decision on that. But I think it was largely just based on the technical feedback that they got to up to that point.
Matt, any last thing you wanted to add before we move on?
Yeah, so I think the things I'm hearing from my panelists are clearer prioritization, clearer formalization, perhaps, of what is included and what isn't included, and so we can allocate the time of the core devs to things that are actually going to matter for Ethereum. And I think I'm on board with both those things. I just stress a little bit on the prioritization side. I think there's still a lot of disagreements between core dev teams, but also just the Ethereum community in general about not only how should Ethereum scale, but also what protocol changes should we make that are not related to scaling. And I think so that becomes a pretty major issue as your complexity balloons upwards, right? You can have a minor disagreement when the protocol is simple, but if we add native rollups, if we go down the path of EOF or had gone down that path, and then we have to make a change from there, then we have more and more complexity. And so I think over time, prioritization from the top becomes even more important. And so I just stress that we focus on clear direction setting and getting into the details of prioritization.
Okay, changing gears a bit, another facet of Ethereum that sets it apart from pretty much any other ecosystem is its emphasis historically on solo validators. And having scaled that number to 100,000, there's now been a change in protocol from the Pectra upgrade, MaxEB, that should theoretically consolidate some of those, but we haven't seen very much of that occurring. So first, I want to just quickly touch on that specific subject. Why do you think that is, and how much of an impact is that having on the expected performance gains that the base layer should have gotten?
Yeah, so maybe just for some numbers here, only about 2% of validators have consolidated since Spectra. I put a tweet out like a week ago that was just asking like why haven't we done more validators, and I get a response from Coinbase and a couple other validator teams like node operators privately, and the consensus that I'm hearing is that first of all, it takes a lot of time to move their processes over to this new type of staking, and apparently they were not prepared for that before the fork. I'm also hearing that the incentives are not necessarily aligned. Apparently Lido did some research that revealed that their staking APY would actually go down by a little bit if they consolidated. And so those things are I think probably the two major reasons we haven't seen that. In terms of how important it is, I think it's going to be more important in the future as we start to crank the validator requirements. But I mean, with any consensus protocol, it's just going to be more painful if you have millions of validators versus a couple thousand.
Yeah, I think when we talk about the solo staker ideology and the ways in which it has affected Ethereum's ability to scale, I think there's two ways that it has, and one of them is this effect on the architecture of the consensus protocol, where you have consensus among many more public keys than you others would. And MaxEB helps with that, but obviously you'd really need to raise the minimum limit to actually reduce that. And I think that is a big issue. And if I were dictator of the Ethereum protocol, I would probably raise the minimum amount of ETH required to stake in order to lower the number of keys that you had to get consensus among. But I think even the more important way that has affected it is that on almost every decision, it has affected how we think about node requirements. and the limits that you could what you're allowed to expect of validators, or what you're allowed to expect of consensus participants. And I think that's just been I think an incredibly limiting force in terms of what we allow, and not just what the requirement that we actually have allow home stakers, but this idea that people have in their heads, a lot of whom are non-technical people, about what a home staker is or what a home staker is able to do, that isn't really entirely grounded in empirical reality. And so I think that's just, I think that, or people who are identifying, the need for saying we need to limit this so that we can have things like censorship resistance, when it may not actually be the best way to deliver censorship resistance. And if you actually wanted to maximize that value, you might want to make different choices in the protocol. So I do think that, and I think this is something that generally the space has shifted, I think, a bit away from. But I think that ideology of we shouldn't do this so-and-so because of solo stakers, I think has been very harmful to Ethereum's ability to scale. And I think luckily maybe that ice is melting.
Can I take the other side of this? So first of all, not having a spec, not having a validator spec is clearly a problem because there's nothing to bench against. But if you had a spec that was kind of implicitly what Ethereum has today, I think if you did the work, you could squeeze at least 10 to 100x more performance out of that spec, out of the Raspberry Pi in the Sahara Desert, because even those computers are really fast. And 13 TPS is really, really, really slow. And so I kind of feel like I feel responsible for starting this crusade against the solo stakers because I was, on a plane and I was bored and I started tweeting about it. But it's clear that you need a spec. I'm just not sure how high the spec needs to be. One thing Ethereum could do is say, we are the chain for solo stakers. That means this is the spec. This is how much upload bandwidth you need. This is how much download bandwidth you need. This is how much CPU you need. And this is how much memory you need. And then optimize for that. And then I think you could basically at least, 10 to 100x performance. You could get, there's just actual technical changes that don't require anything to do with hardware scaling. And I think we're finding that on Solana right now. We have these big beefy machines, but if our machines were 10 times less beefy, we wouldn't lose that much performance. And the real thing that's bottlenecking us is bugs and implementation. And nobody talks about that on Ethereum. People talk about it a lot on Solana. And so we've been fixing a lot of them, and we've seen a ton of performance improvement without increasing hardware, without changing the protocol at all. Just, stopping doing stupid stuff in the software, stopping copying stuff over and over and over again into different stages. All of these changes could happen in ETH, and you could just squeeze more performance out that way and not have to argue with solo stakers and change anybody's mind. Everybody wants Ethereum to scale. It's just maybe you don't even have to kick anybody off the network. You can just make better software.
Yeah, I think there's an effort to formalize node requirements. Kev from the EF with EIP 7870, I believe. It's still in the review process, but I do think the first step to raising node requirements is to formalize them. And so with that EIP, and hopefully that ends up getting through, then we can start to raise those. I even think bringing up our validators on the, not even hardware, including bandwidth, to that spec as proposed would go a long way towards where we can scale. But that still means we do have to increase the gas limit. And so, there's been a push for 60 million gas limit that hasn't gotten enough support yet. And so I think validators just need to vote with their gas limit. And we can start pushing the gas limit up. Just raising the node requirements isn't enough. We do need to encourage that. And quite frankly, there doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite among node operators for 60 million.
Yeah, maybe as far as the sort of general ethos of Ethereum to try to allow home stakers or to have solo stakers, even if you increase the requirements and these can be reasonably met, is there a sense in which this becomes an impediment to doing things like reducing the slot times? Is there a sense that the level of decentralization or the benefits from decentralization, I know, Dan, you like to say it's not really about decentralization per se, but what do you get out of it, don't necessarily require the diversity of validators that we have in Ethereum?
Yeah, I think something Tolly says pretty frequently is that issuers can just run their own node, and so it doesn't matter what the requirements are because they get billions of dollars on chain anyway. It's worth it for them. And I think we've had a few discussions about this, and I think the point of contention is really what is the value in having like hard fork resistance? Because yes, you can hard fork if the majority of the network goes against what you know is correct, but that takes a lot of time and effort from, you know, Solana Foundation would have to choose a fork, and all the other issuers would have to choose a fork where they redeem deposits for. So I think that would be the one, I guess, important point there. And then going back to like the ethos of home staking, I think really the core is being able to verify the network. But there's two responsibilities, right? There's like attesting, proposing, and then verification, I guess you could throw in there. For attesting, we can reduce node requirements for that while increasing node requirements for proposing, perhaps, and have two different types of validators. There's ways to do these things. I just think the burden right now is that we're not doing any of them. And so we got to get on that.
I guess I would again say that this is a technical software design problem and not a bandwidth or geographic distribution or any other kind of problem. So why are Ethereum slot times so comically long? Because somebody said it takes 4 seconds to get the block there. It takes 4 seconds to build the block. It takes 4 seconds to aggregate the votes. It takes 4 seconds to send the votes or something like that. So basically somebody just said this thing takes 4 seconds, and it just doesn't take 4 seconds if you don't implement the networking stack the way that they implemented it. So right now, if I build an Ethereum block as a validator and I send it out, it does take a really, really, really long time. And the reason for that is like just a complete skill issue in broadcast. So if Ethereum were to adopt something like Turbine, then it would go down by a factor of 10x in time. It would go down by a factor of, 4 or 5x in bandwidth cost, depending on how you set the constants. And the reason for that is what I do is I pick 10 of my closest friends to send the block to, and they pick 10 of their closest friends to send the entire block to. Or it might be 8. I don't know what exactly the number is, but basically I'm sending it to 8 people. They're sending it to 8 people. And so you're basically taking log base 10 or log base 8 of the number of full nodes. And that's how many rounds of communication it takes to get to the furthest person who needs to vote on the block. And it doesn't need to be like that. You can use erasure coding like we do in Turbine. You can use something even more fancy, like I know Poches from the Prism team has suggested using RLNC, which I would suggest that's a little bit too complicated, but whatever, do whatever works and get that time down. And then immediately you've shaved off 3 seconds that don't need to be there. And I think that's in addition to another 6 seconds or so of padding that is like 0 protocol changes, 0 networking changes required. Just cut everything in half. And for the most part, you will have a very good system. You might have a few more skipped slots. But so after you get down to 6 seconds, there's another 3 seconds of pretty low hanging fruit if you implement something like Turbine. And nobody talks about that because they all are talking about whether we need to eliminate solo stakers or not. No, you need to just like change the constants and then fix this networking problem, and you're already down to 3 seconds.
Okay, let's move on to some quick fire Q&A. Let's start with, if there's one EIP that you would kill tomorrow, what would it be and why?
I don't think it's even an EIP yet. There have been some, but I think the idea of ePBS, enshrined PBS, the idea of enshrining an auction to maximize value extracted as a way of building a block into the core protocol is like, it seems like the most harmful thing you could do to an L1. And again, I think it is right now the equilibrium, and so it's reasonable that it exists, that people do it. But I think forcing people to do that instead of anything better, I think, would be about it's like essentially making sandwiches mandatory is roughly how I would think about this as a proposal. It seems about as bad as you could do, and the amount of effort that has gone in to making it work or making other things work so that we can enshrine it seems very perverse to me.
Yeah, and you don't get very much from it either. I agree with Dan there. I think ePBS would probably be the first to go for me.
Can I? Okay, I think I saw Terrence in the audience. I don't know if I was seeing a ghost, but like, I don't want to kill the EIP. I want to take the ePBS part out, and the rest of it's very good. So the rest of it is everything you need for asynchronous execution, which is something I've been working very hard to try and get done on Solana, and I think is a very good change for the protocol. And I think the fact that ePBS is slapped onto it is making the what is otherwise a very good EIP extremely controversial. And I think if they were to say, hey, like, let's do the good parts of this proposal and the part that's controversial, which is what you mentioned, enshrining a revenue maximizing auction that maximally fucks over the user. If they took that part out and then they said, we're just going to do like these really good async changes, it would go in immediately. I mean, I don't know the state of the politics anymore, but like it seems like it would go in immediately if they just took that part out, and all of the work and experiments that they've done would actually be useful.
I think there are some EIPs that are just a clean delayed execution right now. I forgot the number exactly on it, but yeah, but that's definitely I think a priority for a lot of people.
Well, but like the people who are pushing very hard for this proposal are using async execution as a Trojan horse to bring ePBS into the protocol.
Some might be, but I think others, like I'm strongly in favor of delayed or asynchronous execution and not in favor of EPS. I think a lot of people are.
Yeah, I know that. I'm just saying, like, there are people who are, doing great work, who did a lot of the implementation, who are pushing very hard to not do async without ePBS, and they should just give up on the ePBS part.
Okay, we'll have to follow up on that one later. Next, should Ethereum upgrade its state tree? At one point, Verkle trees was going to be the main driver of the Fusaka hard fork, and now you don't hear much about it anymore.
It's not clear to me that Ethereum should have the state commitment in the block header. Bitcoin doesn't, Solana doesn't. I think the event route is very valuable in that it lets you attest that something happened and was valid on the chain. I think the state route is maybe somewhat useful, but I feel like there would be way better ways to do it by taking it out of the protocol.
Absolutely not a bottleneck. No, I mean, like this thing is not a bottleneck. Just don't change it. It's not a bottleneck. Move on, right?
Yeah, agreed with Max.
Okay.
What do you mean? You don't think it's a bottleneck?
The difference between Verkle or Merkle.
I
thought that was the question.
I think just the computation of the state route at all happening after the block, I think is a huge bottleneck.
It's not that big. It's on the order of 20 milliseconds in Nethermind, which is not. That's 20 milliseconds when your blocks are 12 seconds is not a big bottleneck for you guys. For us, it would be the biggest flame in the flame graph, but for you guys, it's like a tiny little thing.
Yeah. Which is more dangerous to Ethereum, L1 bloat or complexity, or L2 fragmentation?
Sorry, L1 bloats and complexity, or what?
Complexity to the L1.
Or L2 does what?
Fragmentation. Like fragmentation of
Fragmentation.
users and liquidity and so on. Stump the panel.
I think the fragmentation would be it. I mean, the complexity issue is just don't increase the complexity and try to reduce the complexity, and then that'll help us. But it's not nearly as urgent as at least figuring out ways to paste over the fragmentation that we do have on layer 2s.
Yeah, I think L1 complexity does not live in user space, so it could be like all of our problems for the most part, and L2 complexity almost inherently does. So yeah.
I think Solana protocol is probably about 10 times more complex than the Ethereum protocol, and it doesn't affect users whatsoever. It makes my life harder, but devs need to eat. Devs need to chew glass and stop complaining, and like they need to make sure that the users and the apps are the top priority. And if it means adding, a few thousand lines of code to the spec, that's okay, as long as it reduces latency by 10 milliseconds for the user. That's fine.
It's a lot harder to do that when you have more than 2 execution and consensus clients.
Okay, let's do 1 minute closing statements here. Between now and the next permissionless conference, what are the most important things that Ethereum needs to do in terms of scaling?
Yeah, I think increase the block limit on the gas limit on L1. I would love to see some progress on latency by then, which is maybe even more important than gas limit, but I would be doubtful that we'd do, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would say 6 seconds in the next hard fork for sure is easily possible. Just change the constants. And then devs need to start being more vocal on Twitter, because what happens is like the the people who are talking on Twitter are like the three of us, and we're not posting experiments. Well, I'm not posting experiments about ETH. I'm posting them about Solana now. But like, if you have insight as a dev that is like, I ran this bench on my machine, and everybody on Twitter is a talking head who's wrong, post it, and you'll get tons of clout, and we will move the conversation forward in a way that is extremely productive. The echo chamber of Twitter of people talking about things they don't understand is exactly why Ethereum stalled for 4 years on a useless roadmap. And I think if you're a dev in the audience, like, start being more vocal and explaining to everybody you have some specialized knowledge about your specific area, and you have the ability to spend a bunch of time benching and running experiments. And I think if you share that with crypto Twitter, which unfortunately is where a lot of these roadmap discussions take place, then you're more likely to have something reasonable and not something that's like a bunch of chuckleheads like us three, like, deciding the roadmap.
Yeah, I'd put gas limit and slot time as the top two, and then below that, pure DAS and fossil.
All right. Well, if you would like to keep up with Ethereum scaling, one place you can do that is Blockworks 0x Research newsletter, which you can find at blockworks.co/newsletter. Thank you very much for this debate. And yeah, I look forward to seeing it continue on Twitter.